Daoism stands alongside Confucianism as one of the two great philosophical and religious systems of China. At its core, Daoism revolves around the concept of the Tao, which can be translated as the way, the path, or the road. The essence of Daoism lies in understanding and aligning oneself with this fundamental principle of the universe, that is, the Tao. Daoism incorporates both philosophical and religious aspects, and its teachings have been recorded in various texts, the most famous of which is the Tao Te Ching, attributed to the sage Lao Tzu. Another important text is the Zhuangzi, attributed to the philosopher Zhuangzi, written in the 4th century BCE. It is important to note that Daoism has a diverse history with different branches and interpretations and has existed in China for thousands of years. Some forms of Daoism are more philosophical leaning, focusing on principles for living a balanced and harmonious life, while others may be considered more traditionally religious, involving organized practices and beliefs in supernatural entities. It ought to be noted, however, that this distinction between religion and philosophy, as we'll talk about later in the video, is an arbitrary one with respect to Daoism, and that Daoism as a whole integrates both of these aspects into its overall worldview. This video will explore the more theoretical aspects of Daoism. Specifically, we will talk about the meaning of the term Tao itself and a crucial component and principle of Daoism known as Wu Wei. This concept refers to the principle of non-action or effortless action. I hope that you enjoy the content of this video. Please feel free to leave me any questions or thoughts that you have about Daoism in the comments section below. So to begin with, I want to talk about some important text and people that provided the foundation of Daoism, what is called classical Daoism anyways. So as I mentioned before, Daoism has existed in China for thousands of years. Traditionally speaking, when we talk about the origins of Daoism, we date it to the 4th century BCE and attribute it to authors such as Lao Tzu or Zhuangzi. However, it's important to note that, for example, the concept of the Tao itself, ideas like, if you're familiar with the yin and yang symbol, that all of this predates the formalized version of Taoism that we see in the 4th century. And that these concepts and ideas had been floating around China, so to speak, for quite some time before then. So although we use the starting point of 400 BCE, just keep in the back of your head that these ideas predate that. Most of this video will focus on the ideas and principles of classical Taoism, referring to that early starting period beginning around 400 BCE. But also keep in mind, like as with any philosophical or religious system that has existed for thousands of years, it has dramatically changed over that time. So I don't want to simplify it too much, but if we were to cover Taoism as a whole, Taoism for the past thousands of years, that would of course take a lot longer than 30 minutes that I'm going to use to talk about it in this video. So I'm just going to focus on that classical period. Now, in the classical period, there are kind of two central texts that we're going to be drawing from. I'm going to quote these throughout this lecture. The first and foremost, we have the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching, written early 400 BCE. As we'll see, the Tao Te Ching is a collection of poetry that's divided up into a number of chapters, and it's attributed to the sage Lao Tzu. Now, the story goes that Lao Tzu was leaving China, and he was kind of stopped by a guard who was really sad to see him leave, and asked Lao Tzu that if before he left, could he write down his wisdom. And so as he's leaving China, he writes down the Tao Te Ching, which is the series of poems, and gives it to the guard to pass along this tradition of Taoism, which is supposed to be like the wisdom of Lao Tzu. So the issue with this, and that the reason why I bring up this story, I want to draw attention to this. When I say that the Tao Te Ching is a central text of Taoism, the problem here is that a lot of the terminology that I'm going to use can be used and related back to sort of Western traditions and Western religions and philosophical practices. Text here and authorship here doesn't carry the same weight for Taoism as it does for, say, like Christianity or Islam, right? If I were to ask you what is the central text of Islam, the answer to that is the Quran. And if you were to go around and ask Muslims, like, do you believe in the Quran, or what sort of importance does the Quran have? The Quran is the central text of Islam. Not only is it the central text of Islam, it's like literally considered by Muslims to be the word of God. So it obviously carries a lot of weight, and a lot of emphasis is placed on what exactly the Quran says. And the same could be true of the Gospels for Christianity. But it's not true of Taoism. Yes, the Tao Te Ching is one of the foundational texts of Taoism, but the Tao Te Ching is not treated within Taoism as the Quran is treated within Islam or as the Gospels are treated within Christianity, if that makes sense. And although Lao Tzu is traditionally said to be the author of the Tao Te Ching, historically speaking, the Tao Te Ching probably had many authors, was composed over a wide period of time, and it's possible that Lao Tzu himself didn't even exist, that this is formed kind of after the fact. But none of that is really horribly important for Taoism as a philosophical system, in the same way that it would be important for Christianity as a religious system for Jesus to be a real person. So we have the Tao Te Ching, 400 BCE, and the Zhuangzi. Now, the Zhuangzi is written later than the Tao Te Ching. It's influenced by the Tao Te Ching, and Zhuangzi himself was probably a historical figure. Like the Tao Te Ching, though, the Zhuangzi is hard to categorize in terms of genre. It includes everything from different stories to poetry to humorous tales to aphorisms, sayings, folk tales, that sort of thing. We'll include some stories of the Zhuangzi here in this slide, and hopefully that'll kind of explain what this means. But the Zhuangzi and the Tao Te Ching comprise the foundations of classical Taoism and is where we get a lot of these concepts that we're going to talk about in this video, specifically the concept of the Tao and the concept of Wu Wei. But before we get to that, I want to talk more about this kind of classical separation that we make. And I say we here, we as in Westerners make with respect to philosophy and religion. Now, there's been this classical distinction in the West between these two disciplines, between these two subjects, mostly. So when we talk about religion, let me if I were to ask you to kind of do like some free thought, free association, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of religion? Now, of course, I come from the United States. If you can't tell that already, I teach classes in the United States. Most of my students are from the United States. And so most people from the United States, when they think of religion, they think of the Judeo-Christian religions as well as Islam. And so when they think of religion, they think about like God talk. Religion is talk about God. It's defining who and what God is, what God's like, what God expects out of us, how God expects us to act and behave, stuff like that. That's typically what we think of when we think of religion, as well as the various sorts of different practices that goes along with that. So if we're talking about Judaism and Islam, for example, we might think of the different dietary practices. If we think of Christianity, we might think of things like the different sacraments that people do within churches and stuff along those lines. Whereas if I were to ask you the same question about philosophy, what do you think of when you think of philosophy? Now, hopefully at this point, if you're taking a class with me right now, you'd be able to give some sort of coherent definition of philosophy. That philosophy is a search for the critical understanding of the world around us through the process of critical thinking and critical discussion, right? But philosophy traditionally deals in the West with subjects such as metaphysics, ethics, logic, political philosophy, and we generally separate those two. And we say that like philosophy is about justifying your arguments and claims, and religion is more so about belief. We might make that sort of distinction. Now, this is inherently problematic because those distinctions and categories don't really exist within the Eastern tradition. So a system such as Taoism is going to incorporate aspects from both. And to try to say that Taoism is a philosophy or that Taoism is religion is to inherently limit what we mean by Taoism. I have some quotes here by some Taoist scholars that kind of speak to this point. Louis Camathi says the following: such a bifurcated interpretation, bifurcated that separation between philosophy and religion, such a bifurcated interpretation of Taoism is flawed and inaccurate. It involves a systematic misunderstanding and misinterpretation of classical Taoism, usually through selective readings of inaccurate translations of classic Taoist texts, such as the Tao Te Ching. Reference to the so-called philosophical Taoism and or religious Taoism should be taken ipso facto as an accuracy and misunderstanding with respect to the Taoist tradition. So we can't really draw or make that distinction with respect to Taoism. And the reason why we can't is because Taoism incorporates topics that are traditionally attributed to either philosophy or religion. But Taoism takes it as an and. Yes, I'm confusing myself here, but it takes both aspects. Gil Raz, in his book, The Emergence of Taoism, says that Taoism is not a clearly definable religion in terms of a Western religion. We should consider the Taoist religion not as a unitary phenomenon, but as an assemblage of intersecting textual and ritual lineages. That Taoism is a collection of various Chinese folk practices and beliefs, many of which predate the establishment of Taoism as an organized system. Livia Kuhn, who I've actually interviewed on this channel before about Taoism, I'll link that video in the description of this video. In her book, Introducing Taoism, she says about the Tao Te Ching specifically that it can be read as a religious, political, military, or naturalistic treaty dealing with psychology, the natural world, or society. In other words, you can read the Tao Te Ching as a religious text, but you can also read it as a political text or even as a military text. And in the interview that I had with Dr. Kuhn, she talks about the fact that Taoism incorporates many different things. So in that interview, she talks about things like Taoist medicine, Taoist exercise, Taoist diet, that we're not just talking about like philosophy in the sense that you're taking this philosophy class with me and we're going to have conversations about like ethics, about how we should live our lives, about metaphysics, questions like what is reality. Like, yes, there is that aspect, as we'll see when we talk about the Tao, but there's also things about like correct diet, like what sort of foods we should eat, proper exercise. In the introduction to this video, I showed you some movements and forms from a martial art called Tai Chi. Tai Chi is rooted in Taoism, the idea, the kind of philosophical idea behind Tai Chi. It's a Taoist practice. It's something that practitioners of Taoism do in order to express their Taoistic beliefs, so to speak. So we're dealing with things like diet to martial arts and exercise, kind of this holistic understanding of life. Also things like alchemy, astrology, kind of the natural sciences, all of that kind of taken together. And this is why it's hard to put into those kind of two separate categories of philosophy or religion because it includes all sorts of different things. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So Taoism can't be fit into like this neat little categories that we like to impose upon things. So let's talk about some of these major ideas that kind of lie at the heart of Taoism. And to begin with, we should talk about what the Tao itself is, where Taoism gets its namesake from. And to do that, I want to read through the first chapter of the Tao Te Ching, which talks about the concept of the Tao. And this is what the Tao Te Ching says. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. The named is the mother of 10,000 things. Ever desireless, one can see the mystery. Ever desiring, one can see the manifestations. These two spring from the same source, but differ in name. This appears as darkness. Darkness within darkness, the gate to all mystery. Okay, so what the heck does that mean? Well, first and foremost, we can say that when we're trying to classify, define, or understand the Tao, that it's going to be a concept that resists classification, that it resists language, that it resists us putting it into these boxes. And this is very similar in the Western tradition, even though I said not to draw distinctions between Eastern tradition and Western tradition. I'm going to do so anyway, just because I can't really help myself, but you take it all with a grain of salt. In the Western mystic tradition, we have this understanding or this idea that God is beyond sort of linguistic interpretation, that the divine is ineffable, that it can't be pinpointed, that it can't be contextualized, defined, or put in a box. And that when we attempt to do so, when I attempt to describe to you what exactly God is, that I'm doing inherent injustice to God itself, because I'm inherently limiting God by putting God into language. A very similar sort of idea here, that when we're trying to express or describe the Tao, that we're going to be inherently unable to do so because the Tao is not something that can be described. But of course, this is a college class and I have to describe it for you in order to hopefully allow it to make sense for you. So we're going to do the impossible here. But look at how the poem unfolds here. So we kind of have this dichotomy that's present. Notice especially the middle section here. The nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. It's the beginning of all things. It's the source of all things. The named, so we go from nameless to the named. The named is the mother of 10,000 things. So when we name it, we're limiting it. Now we can limit it to, we're still talking about 10,000 things, so it's a lot, but it's not as great and it's sort of different from that which is nameless. The desireless, ever desireless, one can see the mystery. So if it's desireless, we can't really categorize it or to put it into a box. Desiring, one can see the manifestation. So once we start to desire it, once we start to try to grasp it, then we can start to categorize it. And desiring is what we're doing now with this sort of categorization. But it ends with saying that these two spring from the same source. So ultimately, we're trying to grasp and describe the same thing. And this appears as darkness, right? This is mysterious. This is complicated. So the first issue that we run into when we're talking about the Tao, of course, is how to define it. Tao is translated in a couple of different ways, and these different definitions sort of indicate what exactly we mean by it. So Tao can be translated as the way. Now, way can mean, way is kind of vague in English, and that might be helpful to us here, as in like it could be the way that we do something, like this is the way to put in a screw into the wall, for example, in terms of like technique or practice. It could also be understood as way as in like a guide, like this is a general guideline about how to do something. And then we also have this translation as road. So when you're traveling to a particular destination, how you're going to get to that destination is by the road itself. The traveler travels on the road, and the road kind of guides the traveler to where they want to go. Now, we have this really awesome quote from the Zhuangzi that I think kind of might help us to better understand what Tao means. The Zhuangzi says that humans interact in Tao as fish do in water. So if you think about the environment that a fish lives in, think about it in sort of a spatial metaphor here. Water permeates everything that the fish lives in and does. Water is also what sustains the fish, is also what allows the fish to live, and is what the means by which the fish itself does anything that it's going to do. So the analogy is that the Tao is the same for humans as water is for the fish, that humans interact in the Tao as a fish interacts in water. To quote St. Paul here, who's quoting a Greek philosopher in the book of Acts, when he says that God is that in which we live, move, and have our being. So one way to think about the Tao is that the Tao is sort of the ultimate sustaining metaphysical principle of existence, that the Tao is the source of everything, that the Tao is the source of life, that the Tao is the source of nature, of the universe, of humanity, as sort of this overarching metaphysical principle. And if we think about it in that way, to try to categorize the Tao even further, and of course, by doing this, we're moving further away from what the Tao means, but bear with me. If we kind of interpret it as a metaphysical principle, we can see kind of, especially within the Western tradition, that Taoism is sort of promoting a kind of monism. Now, monism metaphysically refers to the idea that ultimate reality is ultimately one thing, one substance. Now, monists disagree about what that one thing or what that one substance is. So a monist today might say that that one thing or substance could be consciousness, that consciousness predicates all of reality. The Taoist, of course, would say that it's the Tao, in the same way that when we talked about Hinduism, that Brahma kind of permeates everything. Now, we want to be careful here because the Tao is not an entity in the same way that a God is an entity. The Tao is not a thing or a substance, that it transcends those categories, ultimately speaking. So, yes, we are dealing with a kind of monism here, but we want to be careful not to limit it too much. Another way to think about it is that the Tao is a concept of guidance in terms of human action, even that The Tao can be interpreted as a sort of metaphysical principle about how we should run society, the relationship between government and its people, between a parent and its child, and also sort of the kind of a general ethical principle that we can use to guide our lives, as we'll see with this concept of Wu Wei. But ultimately, however, we have to remember that at the end of the day, the Tao is indefinable. It's unable to be put or characterized in these boxes that we want to put it in. Now, I want to focus on this idea as the Tao as a guiding or ethical principle, because I think this gets at the heart of the other concept that I want to talk about, which is this idea of Wu Wei. Now, it might seem kind of odd to talk about it as an ethical principle, because what sort of ethical principle, how would it look, or what sort of ethical ideas can we derive from that? In order to explain this, I want to share you a quote from a philosopher that I really enjoy that you might be familiar with, Bruce Lee, who actually wrote a book called The Tao of Jeet Kune Do, in which he talks about the Tao in relation to martial arts. And this, I think, will be a helpful analogy to kind of understand how this could be applied as an ethical principle. So here's Bruce.
This is what it is, okay? I said, empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now, you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now, water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
Now, of course, Bruce Lee is best known for being a A-list Hollywood celebrity, but not many people know that Bruce Lee was also a philosophy major and that he wrote a book about philosophy titled The Tao of Jeet Kune Do, in which he talked about the way, the path of martial arts. And martial arts is an analogy that might be helpful in helping us to understand the larger context of Taoism, but also this principle of Wu Wei. And this is not something that's foreign to Taoism. You can see this, for example, in the introduction to this video. I showed you some clips of some Tai Chi practices. Martial arts, physical exercise, bodily movement is something that is inherent to Taoism itself, especially if we're talking about it within this holistic concept. Now, the Tao with respect to martial arts, Bruce Lee pioneered what would become known as mixed martial arts. And this is important because with the analogy of water, Bruce Lee says that water basically takes the shape of whatever container that it's put it into. That when water encounters an obstacle like a rock, that water flows around that rock, that water adapts to whatever situation that it happens to find itself in. For Bruce Lee, this was extraordinarily important with respect to martial arts because martial arts, violence in general, is inherently chaotic. It's crazy. We have no idea what's going to happen next or what sort of situation that we're going to be put in next. So the most important idea, according to Bruce Lee, when entering into violence, when entering into conflict, was to be adaptable, to be malleable, to flow like water, because we're not sure entering into a fight what situation we're going to be put in. Maybe our opponent is an excellent striker and is going to force us to stand up and to strike with them. Maybe they're an Olympic level wrestler and the goal of the opponent will be to take us to the ground. The idea that Bruce Lee put forward is that the martial artist ought to be comfortable in whichever situation that they find themselves in, whether standing on the ground, in a clinch, anywhere in between. And we can take this as a general ethical principle that can be applied to all areas of the life. And to highlight this point, I want to read you a story from the Zhuangzi about a butcher and a lord. And the story illustrates the general idea of Wu Wei and how Wu Wei is applied to all areas of life. The following passage from the Zhuangzi was translated by Edward Singerland. This is what the Zhuangzi says concerning the butcher. At every touch of his hand, every bending of his shoulder, every step of his feet, every thrust of the knee, he guided his blade along with a whoosh, and all that was in perfect tune. One moment as if he were joining the dance of the mulberry grove, another as if he were performing in the symphony. The Lord, amazed by his movements, exclaimed, "Ah, wonderful! Can skill really reach such heights?" The butcher put down his cleaver and replied, "What I, your humble servant, care about is the way, or the Tao, which goes beyond mere skill, When I first began cutting up an ox, all I could see was the ox itself. After 3 years, I no longer saw the ox as a whole. And now I meet it with my spirit and don't look at it with my eyes. My senses and conscious awareness have shut down, and my spiritual desires take me away. I follow the heavenly pattern of the ox, thrusting into the big hollows, guiding the knife through the big openings, and adapting my motions to the fixed structure of the ox. In this way, I never touch the smallest ligament or tendon, much less a main joint. Whenever I come to a knot, I see the difficulty ahead, become careful and alert, focus my vision, slow my movements, and move the blade with the greatest subtlety so that the ox simply falls apart like a clod of earth falling to the ground. Wonderful, the Lord exclaimed. From the words of the butcher, I learned how to live my life. So, from the art of this practice, whether we're talking about martial arts or the art of butchering, from the art of this practice, the Lord says that he's learned how to live his life. The butcher going along with the shape and the curve of the ox, even when the butcher might encounter resistance or encounters a problem, he essentially applies that same principle around it in order to go with it. The same with the analogy of water, that that in the flow of the water, it has a particular direction, it has a particular course, that it's following the shape and the curves of the river, and you never see water acting or flowing against that. This is essentially what we mean by the concept of Wu Wei, or actionless action, or non-action, or inaction, is to kind of go with the natural flow and the course of things, to not to strive against or to act out of place, to do something that might be uncharacteristic of us. Because the danger there is when we try to do that, it's only going to incur more hardship. So, an example that Dr. Kohn uses is when she applies this to the act of parenting, right? There are different parenting styles that you may encounter if you're a parent, or at the very least, you're a child. So, you experienced some of these yourself, but you have more lenient parenting on the one hand, and then more like authoritarian or more heavy handed parenting on the other. Now, with respect to authoritarian parenting, what's the downside of that? What's the problems that arises when you try to put very strict, harsh rules and limitations on the child, that the child acts against it, that the child rebels against it, that the child doesn't want to do what you say? The same may be true of, and this is how Daoism is applied to like systems of government. If we think about what good or correct leadership looks like, and you think of like heavy-handed governments that want to heavily police and monitor its citizens, the problem with that is that it inherently breeds resistance. And this is kind of what this idea and principle of Wu Wei is trying to get at. Now, I want to read you another quote from the Tao Te Ching that is concerning this principle of Wu Wei. This is from chapter 29 of the Tao Te Ching. Some are meant to lead, and others are meant to follow. Some must always strain, and others have an easy time. Some are naturally big and strong, and others will always be small. Some will be protected and nurtured, and others will meet with destruction. The master accepts things as they are, and out of compassion avoids extravagance, excess, and extremes. So the idea here is that there's a natural flow and order to life. And if we're thinking about Wu Wei as a guiding ethical principle, the principle here would be to go along with that flow and to act in accordance with that flow, to act in accordance with what is natural for our path. Because again, to go back to the parenting or government example, to act against that is to cause problems for ourselves, provide some extra difficulty in our lives that we otherwise would not have had. Okay, so we talked about those two big principles, the Tao and Wu Wei. I hope that that made somewhat of sense. Again, if you're a student of mine, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. More than happy to set up a Zoom meeting to talk about that. If you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to post any questions or comments that you have in the comment section below. I'll try to get to them when I'm able. I hope that you all enjoyed this video, and until next time, have a good one.